Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming and welcome to IPI. Today we have an event under our Humanitarian Affairs series, which is an initiative we started a year ago to focus on a range of issues within this field, because of course we feel that New York is becoming more and more relevant in humanitarian affairs than in the past. Today's discussion is titled The Elusive Quest for Principled Humanitarian Action, Past and Contemporary Challenges. I will give you a little bit of background on the topic and then introduce our panel, and then we go straight into the presentations. I think we are all aware that mega trends like climate change, population growth, geopolitical shift, growing inequalities, the changing nature of violence, and rapid technological innovation are presenting the humanitarian system with a number of new challenges. And as humanitarian actors are under growing pressure to be present and to deliver on the ground, including in very highly insecure and politicized environments, laments about a lost humanitarian golden age proliferate. But has there ever been such a golden age? An age in which humanitarian actors were independent, neutral, and could deliver without interference from donors, from host governments, armed groups, media, and watchful populations? What is the state of principled humanitarian action today, and what are the stakes for the future of the humanitarian endeavor? So I think we have an excellent panel today to answer these specific questions. I will introduce first our two speakers. They will base their intervention on two publications. First of all, it's my great pleasure to introduce Antonio Donini, who's senior researcher at the Feinstein International Center at Tufts University, and is the editor of a new book, we can say new, fairly new, book, The Golden Fleece, which, here you go, hard copy, paperback. Fascinating book. I had a chance to read it recently, and not only for the historical perspective that gives on this topic, but also I think from addressing specific questions that in some way has become kind of dogmatic in the field of humanitarian affairs, and precisely on the issue of manipulation and independence in humanitarian action. He will present, probably focusing a little more on the historical perspective of these challenges. Then my colleague, Jeremy Labbe, who's the senior policy analyst for our humanitarian affairs, will present on a paper that he recently authored, which is available at outside the room, Rethinking Humanitarianism, Adapting to the 21st Century Challenges. And it will take a slightly more sort of future-oriented perspective on these specific challenges. I will introduce our discussants later, who will respond to the presentations. I'll give 8 to 10 minutes, and we'll start with Antonio. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francesco. I have to start with an anecdote, because this is the second time that I present a book at IPI. It used to be called IPA then. And back in 2004, we had put together an edited volume on Afghanistan called Nation Building Unraveled, Aid, Peace and Justice in Afghanistan. And it was February 2004. And I was coming down from Boston, and of course there was a snowstorm, and I made it for the final 10 minutes of the book launch. So I was very afraid that I wouldn't be able to make it this time, but mercifully everything turned out okay. So I just have to say one thing about this book, in addition to saying that there's a few copies here for sale if anybody is desperate to buy it. Why is it called The Golden Fleece? It's called The Golden Fleece because the mythical golden fleece was kind of a gold standard, unattainable wealth or riches. It's unclear exactly what the myth is about. But so it contains this idea that in humanitarianism there is a gold standard somewhere and that we try to reach it. But at the same time, there's the fleecing aspect. And so the book is more about manipulation, instrumentalization, the way in which humanitarian action is used to achieve purposes that are not humanitarian. So I'll make three brief points. One, there never was a golden era, a golden age. The tension between principles, pragmatism, and politics is nothing new. Instrumentalization has always been there. Second point, mixing politics and humanitarian action sometimes allows to achieve short-term gains. But in the long term, we usually have long-term pain. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. And the third is about the future, and I know Jeremy is going to talk more about the future, but how the life of humanitarians is becoming messier and more complicated. And I'll end with a reflection on the baby and the bathwater. So, the golden age. The humanitarian enterprise has seen massive growth and institutionalization over the past 2-3 decades. It now moves something like $15 billion a year. It's become very institutionalized with 250,000 aid workers. And there's the official enterprise and then the sort of gray areas around it. But by and large, growth and institutionalization of the enterprise has not immunized it against instrumentalization, has not immunized it against being used to achieve political goals. Often, humanitarian action relief is being hijacked to achieve political or security agendas. And the clash between the pragmatism of realpolitik and the ethical values that are at the core of the humanitarian message remain basically unresolved. And the pathologies that we see today are, in a real sense, not very different from the pathologies of the past. They may be quantitatively more important or even qualitatively slightly different. For instance, the global war on terror is a kind of globalizing, totalizing aspect of trying to include everything in this agenda. But we have seen similar types of instrumentalization in the past. What perhaps one can argue is that because the enterprise has become so big and powerful, the stakes are now higher. And humanitarianism itself, in a sense, has transitioned from being a powerful ethical discourse to becoming itself a discourse of power because of the power that it moves, the links between the humanitarian enterprise and the political and business spheres. That was my first point. My second point is the chicken coming home to roost point. And if we look at Afghanistan, Afghanistan gives a good object lesson in what happens when principles are sacrificed on the altar of politics. And during the long period of the Afghan crisis, there have been moments when it was easier to try to stay closer to principles and moments when it's been harder. Paradoxically, under the Taliban, it was not easy, but there was a better sense of unity in the aid community on what was possible and what should not be done than after 9/11, after the intervention, coalition's intervention, where Afghanistan has become part and parcel of the promotion of liberal peace or world ordering agendas. So what we've seen in recent years is the incorporation, if not subordination, of humanitarian action to the ever-changing, we're not quite sure what they are, political objectives in Afghanistan. And in a sense, the aid enterprise in Afghanistan, or the humanitarian enterprise, has lost its moral compass. It's become part of an agenda that is essentially a political agenda, which is made worse by the fact that all donors in Afghanistan, with the exception of Switzerland, are also belligerents. So clearly these belligerent donors want to use the humanitarian activities that they finance to participate, promote their political goals. And I think we don't have time to discuss this in detail, maybe in the question and answer, but this has had profound impact on the ability of the system to address need in Afghanistan, where access has become much more difficult, where villagers have greater difficulty in accessing health clinics, for example, because access is constrained, because the humanitarian enterprise is seen as part or aligned with the coalition intervention. So we have blast walls, fortified aid compounds, and the compounds of the UN and those of the coalition look exactly the same from the outside. And even NGOs now are bunkerizing. And what we are seeing is a worrying shift from a kind of face-to-face relationship that NGOs and UN agencies were respected for, face-to-face with the people they're trying to help, to more and more a face-to-screen relationship. We are distant. We are no longer there. We don't have the friendship element anymore. So, third point, what does all this tell us about the future? I think the disconnect between the functioning of a humanitarian establishment that is intent on reproducing and expanding itself and the daily reality of physical and structural violence faced by those that it purports to help, I think this disconnect is growing. We pay a lot of lip service to the perceptions of and the accountability to beneficiaries, but the reality is that the system of large aid agencies and donors that sets the stage for humanitarian action, this system remains stubbornly self-referential. And the structures, practices, and reward systems tend to value growth, if not turf, over principle and effectiveness. So, and this self-referential nature is made worse by the fact that humanitarian action remains inescapably northern and western, both in reality and representation. So what we are seeing perhaps, and this is a question we ask in the book, is that instrumentalization has now become systemic, and that with the increasing centrality of the humanitarian enterprise in world ordering agendas, the risks of and the difficulty of maintaining some respect for principles has become much more difficult. Humanitarian action is an integral part of the way in which the foreign policy of states is established. Aid agencies, NGOs are used as false multipliers, as tools to promote soft power. And these pathologies, of course, are more visible in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, but you know, the nature of the functions that humanitarian action performs are essentially the same in most crises. So what can we do about it? Jeremy is going to talk about the future, but let me say a couple of things. The fact that there is so much that instrumentalization seems to be part of the DNA of humanitarian action is a worrying conclusion. There's an ethical, fundamentally valuable aspect to humanitarian action, to the action of saving lives and protecting people in crisis. But if at the same time it seems that we are continuously implicated in political or even economic agendas, that really creates a big question mark. So the way I would summarize it, and here's the baby and the bathwater, the current international welfare system does not reach everywhere. It's quite disjuncted in the way it reaches people, and not everybody with life-threatening need has ready access to it. So there is no proportionality, or little proportionality, I should say, in how we address suffering. But despite its many warts and biases, the system does continue to save countless lives and represents an ethos that cuts across cultures, and this is a positive aspect. We have a universal ethos, but unfortunately a Western apparatus. But so we should be, in a sense, be wary of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. In fact, the baby is quite healthy. As I've said, there's never been so many people and so much money devoted to humanitarian endeavors. But the bathwater is actually quite dirty. So humanitarian action sometimes soaks in the evil that surrounds it, wittingly or unwittingly, and it performs functions that are linked to agendas that are not technically humanitarian. And sometimes it's even difficult to distinguish the baby from the bathwater, as when human rights, advocacy, development, or entrepreneurial agendas are linked with the humanitarian agenda. And you get mixed up with the relatively straightforward, or at least easy to understand task of saving lives. So this applies mainly to multi-minded organizations, NGOs that do a variety of things, including humanitarian. And then there is the vapor that's coming out of the bath. Over the past 2 decades, we have made exaggerated claims about the power of humanitarianism, whether the purported ability to address the root causes of crisis or its capacity to exist in splendid isolation from capitalism, from Western power and class relations. It doesn't work like that. These links are very strong. So I think now we are better at understanding the place of humanitarianism. So in a sense, the hot air is clearing a bit. And we see that Northern Western humanitarianism and its capacity to act as a mobilizing myth, as a place of energy, as a place of, an endeavor that has replaced other mobilizing myths of the past, like developmentalism or the anti-colonialist movement or revolution in earlier days. So I think humanitarian action has functioned a bit like a myth, but maybe now it's reaching its structural limits. And for me, it's not clear that this myth or this type of activity is going to continue in the same format that it has now, long into the 21st century. So the challenge that we have is to figure out what is going to happen when we pull the plug from the bath. And what will humanitarianism look like when other forces, other non-Western traditions come into the play and have a stronger role. So when China and India develop their own humanitarian bureaucracies and policies, we may be faced by a very different, a kind of Eastphalian humanitarianism that it will be very different from the kind of Westphalian humanitarianism we have now. So I'll just say one word to finish. I think that much too much has been put in the humanitarian basket, and that there's an argument that perhaps we should consider about returning to a more narrow definition of humanitarianism, an activity of saving and protecting lives in conflict in particular, when and based around these time-tested principles, which I agree with Jeremy, they are not absolutes, particularly neutrality and independence are not absolutes. I think impartiality and humanity are absolutes, but neutrality and independence are tools, are means to an end. So I think that a humanitarian enterprise that's closer to these basic principles and that distinguish itself from other worthwhile but different and essentially political activities that deal with rights, that deal with development or deal with politics, that we need a better separation between the two. And I will stop here.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. As I said, really recommend the book because it delves a little more into details on these rooted, instrumentalism in the past, but also on proposal for the future. And speaking about the future, Jeremy Labbé. Jeremy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Antonio, Francesco, sorry, and thank you, Antonio, too, for your brilliant presentation. I will try, as challenging as it is, to pick up where Antonio left. But before a preliminary remark, as Francesco mentioned, those remarks are based on this paper that was published in November 2012, Rethinking Humanitarianism, that looks at how the system has evolves to face growing challenges linked to climate change, population growth, and so on and so forth, and identifies 3 key areas, fundamental areas where the system needs to change, and those are the universality of the undertaking, the relevance of the humanitarian principles, and I will focus today on this, and then third, the quest for increased coherence of the whole humanitarian endeavor, and we will touch upon also some of these aspects in this presentation. So. my presentation is also organized in three parts. I will start where Antonio left by showing that, well, even though there was no golden age, there's never been a golden age of principled humanitarian action, as argued by Antonio. Today, clearly growing ambitions and changing modes of action of the international humanitarian system make the respect for humanitarian principles ever more challenging, and we'll see why quickly. Second, I will take a step back and look at what these humanitarian principles mean and what they're made for. And here I will develop a bit on what Antonio suggested, that there is a difference of importance within those humanitarian principles. And third, I will share some thoughts as well on what might be the place of humanitarian principles in the future of humanitarian action. So first, the international humanitarian system increasingly intends to address root causes of crises rather than their effects only. For humanitarian actors, in order to face a growing humanitarian caseload with finite resources, causes of vulnerability to shocks must be better understood. That's the new mantra. We need to understand better the causes of vulnerability. This will allow to better work with communities and national authorities to prevent disasters, to better prepare to the occurrence of shocks, and ultimately to strengthen the resilience of communities in the longer run so that they can reconstruct better and more quickly. So this requires from humanitarian actors to work with and not around host states to strengthen their capacity to prepare and respond. Secondly, to better link with development aid and inscribe humanitarian aid in the longer term in order to strengthen the resilience of the populations. And third, to increase the coherence of humanitarian aid with, as Antonio mentioned, with broader political objectives of good governance, peace, and state building. While most humanitarian actors subscribe, at least partly, to this agenda and to what is viewed as a necessary change in how we do business, there are also some constant laments from those same humanitarian actors about how to reconcile this approach that increasingly intends to address the root causes, the underlying causes of crisis, while respecting the principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. How to work with the host government in a disaster-stricken country while keeping your neutrality and independence. How to maintain your independence from political goals of UN-integrated missions while contributing to their development or good governance programming. While there is no easy answer to these questions, there is a need to take a step back and deconstruct some of the myth about around humanitarian principles. And I'm coming to my second point here. Those principles were consecrated by resolution, by the resolution of the UN General Assembly, Resolution 46182 in 1991, but defined their origins much earlier in the practice of the Red Cross movement, of which the International Committee of the Red Cross, which I will mention again later, is one entity. So a little clarification on what humanitarian principles are and are not can help to dissipate some of the current misunderstandings about them, the principles. So, as quickly mentioned by Antonio before, humanitarian principles are not all equally important. Humanity and impartiality are values that guide the humanitarian endeavor. Humanity means that the sole purpose of humanitarian action is to save lives and alleviate suffering, considering each life as sacred. Impartiality reflects a belief in the radical equality of each human life. Aid should be delivered without any discrimination and according to one criterion only, the priority of needs. On the other hand, independence and neutrality are operational principles. They are tools that make saving lives in an impartial manner possible. They are field-tested tools to guarantee security of staff and access to populations in need by ensuring the authorities or other gatekeepers of a community that your action is independent from any military or political agenda and does not support any party to a conflict or, for that matter, any political side. An important consequence of this distinction is that a strict respect for humanitarian principles is not relevant in all situations. While humanity and impartiality are values guiding the humanitarian endeavor in all contexts, independence and neutrality are necessary to gain safe access to populations in particularly polarized context of conflict, and arguably less so, less useful or less fundamental in situations of natural disasters like the tsunami that hit Japan 2 years ago, or for that matter, Hurricane Sandy here in New York last year. Finally, respect for humanitarian principles is not an excuse to state avoiding reflexes. While it requires to keep some independence from state authorities in a civil war to ensure equal access to all, it is not antonymic to working with less politicized line ministries or local authorities that can allow the delivery of aid to those in need. However, arguably, it calls for independence from a host government's development strategy if that strategy would exclude some communities from its benefits. And another fundamental aspect of humanitarian principles is that collaboration and dialogue must be pursued not only with the legal authorities in a given country, but also with de facto authorities, authorities of a territory, or more importantly, of a population, namely a potential rebel group. So it's also very important that humanitarian actors can develop this and maintain this dialogue with non-state armed groups. So what does it tell us for the future of principled humanitarian action? And here I'm reaching my third and last point. We saw that humanitarian principles are useful and necessary in specific situations to respond to specific needs. Actually, a study commissioned by OCHA in 2011, entitled To Stay and Deliver, acknowledged that aid agencies the most successful to achieve safe access in conflict situations like Afghanistan, Iraq, or Somalia are those sticking to a strict respect of humanitarian principles and seeking dialogue with all parties to a conflict. And namely, the best examples are the International Committee of the Red Cross and the Médecins Sans Frontières, represented here by Sophie. But humanitarian principles also have some limitations. I think it's important to acknowledge that, as they can sometimes be a restraint to more radical transformative actions, requiring stepping into the political realm or taking side. Not all agencies, I would argue, have the will to respect humanitarian principles, as some are more willing, as hinted to by Antonio, to expand the scope of their activities and to human rights advocacy, to international criminal justice, to peace and state building programs, which requires different modes of action, and sometimes, well, I'm questioning whether it is compatible with a strict respect for those humanitarian principles. So in my conclusion, I would like to raise 3 points in conclusion. First, from my point of view, aid agencies should be more honest with their overall objectives and accept the limitations inherent to their choice. Principled organizations like the ICRC or MSF might have to accept that their role is limited to addressing immediate needs of people affected by crisis, and resist the temptation to address underlying causes to broaden this agenda, as frustrating as it may be and as cross-current as it may be. On the other side, agencies pursuing a broader agenda for change could do so without paying damaging lip service to those humanitarian principles that are not necessarily adapted to those more ambitious objectives. And interestingly, Oxfam, which I think we should have a couple of representatives here, has already made that step in some way by considering that they have no absolute commitment to neutrality, although it acknowledges that it is a useful operational principle in conflict situations. Secondly, and as far as the UN-led, the United Nations-led humanitarian coordination system is concerned, the heterogeneity of relief actors could be better taken into account in practice. And I think that I know that it is already trying hard to take this multitude of actors into account. So there is not a single humanitarian system, but a multitude of actors and networks, including some Islamic charities, foreign militaries, regional and sub-regional organizations, and so on and so forth, that operate alongside traditional humanitarian actors, being principled or solidarist or multi-mandate or whatsoever. So they all have comparative advantages and limitations. They must coexist, coordinate, communicate, but it might be counterproductive to maintain the fiction that they are all part of a homogeneous lot or homogeneous whole. As the saying goes, and trying to copy Antonio with using phrases, one shouldn't put all your eggs in the same basket. Indeed, concretely, what this might require for the UN coordination system to take a step back when the neutrality of the UN is compromised in places like Afghanistan, for instance, that were described by Antonio, and concentrate on analysis, information sharing, standard setting, and linking these different components together at the strategic level, as opposed to operational coordination that might taint other actors, including the principal ones. And I'm saying that taking the step back in particular situations when this might be really required. And last but not least, it might be needed to revisit humanitarian principles as consecrated in Resolution 46182 and develop a more nuanced paradigm. Rather than presenting all humanitarian principles as a single unit that aid organization must take or live in its entirety, it will allow to understand them with a more nuanced contextual lens, depending on their actual utility in a given context. This would allow more pragmatism and less dogmatism in the way humanitarian principles are called upon. And in that logic, relief operations in natural disasters or chronic food insecurity context, even though it's never entirely black and white, and often you have natural disasters in conflict areas, but this could be relief operations in this context, in those less politicized contexts, could be more sensitive to development aid principles of alignment with host state strategies and national ownership without losing completely sight of the overarching principle of impartiality, which would still guide our action. So I thank you very much for your attention. Those are complex issues that I try to simplify, and I'm very much looking forward to more discussion and try to extrapolate on some of those ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. And as you were talking, interesting how the growing scope of intervention is something that is creating challenges in the humanitarian field, and just something that clearly creates challenges also in peace and security field, as growing the so-called Christmas trees mandates and the growing task that peacekeeping missions have. So scope of intervention is something that it's important to think about. We have two excellent discussants with a lot of field experience and knowledge of the system, or systems, we have to say, of humanitarian action. First, Sophie Delaunay, Executive Director of Médecins Sans Frontières, USA. And second, Hans-Jörg Strohmeyer, who doesn't require a lot of introduction here in our humanitarian environment in New York, who is the Chief of Policy Development and Studies branch at the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and has returned quite recently from a one-year assignment in Libya, so has also a very fresh experience of these challenges directly in the field. I will ask them to speak maybe for 5 to 6 minutes, and we start with Sophie. Thank you.
Thanks, Francesco. Can you hear me well? Yes. I must say that it's very difficult. It's hard not to agree with Antonio and Jeremy on what's been said in the precedent address. But so I will try to make my comments a little bit provocative, so that to trigger the discussion later on. And because I guess this is what you expect from MSF anyway, right? So clearly, like Antonio, we don't believe that there has ever been a golden age of humanitarian action. We actually think that not only instrumentalization has always existed, but humanitarian actors also need to accept a certain degree of instrumentalization if they want to operate. Because any space we get is a space that we negotiate, and states, parties to the conflict or occupied forces, they need to see an advantage to our presence. They need to see a benefit that will ultimately serve their political agenda. And without such interest, they have virtually no reason to grant us access or to tolerate our presence on the ground. So what matters for a humanitarian organization is to acknowledge the potential risk for instrumentalization and to balance this risk with the medical, as far as we are concerned, the medical impact, the benefit that we will have on the people we want to serve. And this requires a constant attention to the evolving balance, which means that we need to keep a capacity of judgment and a capacity of decision whenever this equilibrium shifts. And this is why independence, and I agree it's only a tool, but this is why independence is so key, and it does matter, because without some form of independence, whether it is financial independence or independence to operate on the ground and to assess the needs, the organization is in no capacity to make the painful decision of accepting or escaping from being co-opted. So saying that being instrumentalized is inevitable doesn't mean that it's a good thing. And I do agree with Antonio that there are some extreme forms of instrumentalization that he describes in the Golden Fleece that we should actually be aware of and that we should resist against. From my personal experience, the most unacceptable ones are those when assistance turns against those, against the intended beneficiaries. And in cases like those, MSF has at times chosen to withdraw from a crisis or a country. Last year, we resorted to close our medical program in a prison in Misrata in Libya, when we realized that we were used to fix detainees after they had been tortured, so that for them to be tortured again. So as you imagine, using the medical act as a part of the torture continuum poses tremendous dilemmas to an organization like MSF. Another very tragic example of instrumentalization of aid is, in my view, to be found in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. For 18 years, not only has aid been one recurrent bargaining tool of the nuclear talks, but the million tons of food, drug, and cash injected in the country have remained under the full control of the state, and they've been channeled through a system that was always designed to discriminate its population and to reward only its most loyal elements. So 18 years after, it is clear that humanitarian aid has been more effective at keeping the system alive than its most vulnerable people. I told you it would be provocative. In the late 90s, this shocking situation was debated among aid actors in the humanitarian community, and we had very tense discussions and debate. But sadly enough, today nobody ever questions it, and to me, this exemplifies the triumphant success of instrumentalization of aid. So I'd like to end my comments with what I fear could become another quite insidious and inextricable form of instrumentalization. And it is the increased pressure by countries like the United States to subject aid to the counter-terrorist agenda. Although it might sound legitimate for a party at war to try limit the ability of its enemy to get stronger, the regulatory counterterrorism framework as it stands today leaves very few choices to humanitarian actors but to take sides or not provide aid or face liability. because the qualification of material support is so restrictive today that it dramatically limits humanitarian activity in areas controlled by listed terrorist groups or individuals. Let's take Gaza, for example, which for us it's really an area where we are struggling with balancing this compliance and responding to the needs. Even though our project might only consist in treating patients, which is tolerated by the counter-terrorist framework. In fact, you can only do so by hiring local staff, by renting houses and trucks to bring the drugs to the hospital, and by buying food at the market. And in so doing, it is an illusion to believe that you won't deal with individuals who might be involved in banned political activity. And asking aid organizations to confront their staff with this list and to ensure that 0% of their assets go to such individuals forces them either to adopt discriminatory measures and face retaliation later on by those who will no longer believe in our neutrality, or to refrain from delivering aid. Our democracies all stem from so-called illegitimate rebellions, and we all know that today's enemy is likely to become tomorrow's ally, and vice versa. It's clear that aid organizations have an absolute responsibility to ensure that the vast majority of their aid is not serving humanitarian purposes, but they can only do so by keeping a healthy distance from any political agenda, including the counterterrorism one. And our concern is that counterterrorism measures today only serve at making aid partial, which is actually what counterterrorism claims to combat in the first place. So to conclude, I would like to say that the reality is that those who are denied assistance, either because we are afraid of being instrumentalized or because we are prohibited from accessing certain areas, those who are denied aid have little influence over this political choice. And they are the first to suffer from them. And to finish, the last point would be that I'm convinced that instrumentalization will always be part of the humanitarian equation. But the challenge for an aid organization like MSF and many other organizations is clearly to define what is the acceptable degree of instrumentalization for that you can be comfortable with, what is the acceptable degree in principle, and what is the acceptable element of instrumentalization that you need to accept in a given situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you for reminding us the tough dilemmas actually that there are directly on the ground. Ansel, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and also, first of all, thanks to Antonio and Jeremy for their work. I think they're very useful in the sense that they demonstrate the dilemmas and highlight the dilemmas of where the humanitarian enterprise overall is at the moment. They highlight many of the tensions, even if we may answer some of the questions differently. But what I have to say, when we have these types of discussions, and the humanitarian community is notoriously introspect and has these discussions fairly regularly, it is that we talk about the humanitarian enterprise almost as an endangered species. And I would take actually issue with that. I think there are specific dangers that we need to look out for, but overall it is also an enormous land of opportunity. Let me perhaps use that as a little bit as the entry point. Why do I say that, and why is that for me one of the driving forces rather than some of the dangers that we need to look out for? In my view, the whole humanitarian enterprise has already been changing for many, many years. It's very dynamic, it's constantly changing. I just asked my colleagues to verify the latest figures of the consolidated appeals process. I mean, the funding that goes through multilateral channels, which is mostly what we can track. In 2002, I just become chief of staff of OCHA, and that's why I remember very vividly the first cap launch that I was involved in launched $1.9 billion as a cap through multilateral through this multilateral framework. The adjusted figures for 2012 were 8.9 billion, and that shows you in 10 years which way this is going. It has already been, when there are peak crises like the tsunami or so, it has actually even gone beyond, but it's now consistently in a billion-dollar business that we thought a few years ago only peacekeeping might be able to match. We're actually going beyond this. The second thing is, this is only the multilateral funding. There is also increasing funding. There has been increased funding outside of that multilateral framework that goes or has been declared as going for humanitarian purposes. Just the most recent example, the Syria Pledging Conference in Kuwait, more than $1.5 billion, but not $1.5 billion to the United Nations or to this multilateral framework, including the ICRC, IOM, and others. No, I would say probably 500–600 million of that will never go, and some donors actually declared this very specifically, will never go anywhere near this multilateral framework. But it's still $600 million that will go somewhere and that will be dispersed. That, for me, is the challenge. If we have, in Haiti, reported figures, I mean, who knows, who counted, but between 3,500 and 5,000 humanitarian NGOs operating after the crisis 2 years ago, the earthquake. That's something that no coordination outfit on this planet can muster, and let alone could we profess that we could prescribe to all of these a framework of standards and interests that they all would subscribe to. So I think just as a starting point, what we have actually today is a humanitarian, if we want to call it system or enterprise or area, that has actually vastly grown in terms of financial inputs, both on the multilateral and outside of multilateral channels, that has vastly grown in terms of actors, meaning your traditional actors, but also new actors, and Jeremy highlighted some of those. It also has added new pressures, new risks, new concerns, and tensions that Antonio highlighted. The last thing in terms of the outlook is that I think I got a call on Friday night of an ambassador who wanted to see how they could more vigorously coordinate or collaborate with this humanitarian system. And he said, for us, our government has decided that humanitarian assistance is actually one of the key growth areas in the multilateral affairs business. It will continue to grow, just because if you look at the basics, those global challenges, we've talked about it for the last few years. If you look at the demographics, if you look at even the OECD, the recent 2060 Global Growth Report, which says that while a lot of emerging countries and partners will grow, global growth, economic growth, will not lead to more or to less inequality in countries, quite the contrary. And so overall, challenges will increase. Now, and I think Jeremy in his paper somewhere mentioned this, if we go and look at the humanitarian caseload, the expectation today of what humanitarians do, we're squarely looking, I know it's simplistic, but squarely looking at 3 types of caseloads. We look at conflict, which is what we see right now in Syria. We look at natural disaster response, and we look at this very, very difficult area of responding to acute vulnerability, where people, because of these pressures of global challenges and so on, have dropped even from chronic vulnerability, chronic poverty, into acute, abject needs. Why is this important? Because I think, and Antonio attended the Humanitarian Policy Forum that OCHA hosted at the end of last year, and we had really made an effort to bring in a lot of participants from the South. And as you change the mix of participants, you actually change the viewpoint. And many of them said, well, the real interest, the real future actually lies in these areas 2 and 3. there will be more natural disasters because there will be more climate change, there will be more of these disasters. There will be more vulnerability as a result. I just mentioned even the growth predictions. Hence, you will need to find actors among those many NGOs and others that will choose to respond in these types of crises, that would consider themselves humanitarians and that want to deliver food, water, and education and many other things, health. But they also accept that in these types of settings, you will need to work much more closely with governments. You will need to look at issues of knowledge transfer, building capacity, not to entrench ourselves there forever, but to work with governments, to work with developmental partners and others on programs to actually ultimately create the capacities of these governments themselves. That leads me to the point of humanitarian system. I don't think there is one humanitarian system. There is a multilateral system, or a system that has a multilateral framework. But there are others who would consider delivering humanitarian assistance. I mean, Jeremy mentioned some of those. You have the private sector becoming an increasingly important force. We just had a meeting with the Humanitarian Futures Project last week, who said how much for entrepreneurial reasons, not for reasons of doing good, for entrepreneurial reasons, how many private sector actors are increasingly interested in operating in humanitarian settings. In some of the natural disaster settings, how many countries over the last 20 years that have actually made progress in reducing the number of lives lost in natural disasters have actually invested in their domestic military forces, aided by and military assets, aided by international actors. You mentioned also the charities and others, and as I said, I mean, in Kuwait, much of the money that doesn't go through international multilateral channels, in the case of the Kuwait Syria Pledging Conference, will go to Islamic NGOs, Red Crescent, and charities. So all of them do not, and if you also listen carefully to some of the discussions that we are having with the Indias and the Chinas and others, what they're saying is not that we all desperately want to become part of this multilateral system. What they're saying is we want to be able to collaborate, to relate to this, to have some interoperability, perhaps around some basic common standards and ambitions and understandings. But it's not as if all of this could be merged into one, not even coherent, into one system that follows one coordination, let alone by OCHA. So I think what we need to look at is what opportunities for interoperability do we have for discourses around these challenges to principles. I'm not saying we now need to go and accept that every humanitarian service be outsourced to military actors, but we need to accept that some countries have such little developed governance frameworks that before they can actually develop a civilian aid agency that is capable of responding to major floods, they will go for the, as Antonio put it, for the quick gain and develop their military capacities and capabilities. Again, we need to have frameworks. We looked at OCHA, for example. One framework that we have that goes broader, for example, around interoperability is the financial tracking system. That we would say, okay, if lots of money goes outside of the multilateral channel, but what are these people actually doing? Perhaps it is actually very useful, but we need to know so that we avoid duplication and effectiveness. And my last point perhaps goes to the principles and effectiveness. I completely agree that, particularly in those conflict settings, we must ring fence and ensure that the perception of those agencies who operate in these areas is left intact. But we also need to recognize that there is an emerging set of new or other principles, increasingly beneficiaries. And it's interesting if you change the perspective. A lot of the principles, independence, impartiality, neutrality, have to do with the organization that delivers aid. But you change the perspective and you look at what does it look like from a beneficiary perspective, and they're much less interested in these things. They're much more interested in the aid being there timely, being there in adequate amounts, being delivered effectively for agencies to be ready and prepared for these types. I mean, so I'm saying there is a whole separate set of challenges. And very often you have in the same area, in the same environment, multiple of these challenges and operating environments. You have a crisis, you have increasing vulnerability, and you have natural disasters. So one way that some agencies are looking at it right now is whether, at least in certain crisis areas, there could be a certain type of specialization, so that some actually preserve their principles by doing just conflict response, whereas others need to work with governments on natural disaster preparedness and vulnerability reduction. Just one point, and then I finish. Is I very much agree with what my colleague just said on the dangers of counterterrorism. We are currently carrying out a study with a number of partners to look actually at the impact of counterterrorism practice and legislation in countries on humanitarian actors and the humanitarian environment. So what I want to say is none of what I said is to relativize or belittle the importance of principles, but I wanted to say that this humanitarian enterprise is much broader, and we need to have a more refined look, and there may need to be sort of parallel tracks, a multiplicity of actors who do different things in accordance with different sets of interests and principles. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for putting on the table a few interesting proposals. We have 45 minutes for discussion, so we have a good, hopefully many questions from the floor. I see already a few hands. If I can ask you to introduce yourself. Thank you very much. First here.
Good afternoon. I'm glad I braved the weather to come. It's been a very interesting. I seldom take this many notes, but
can you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. I'm Kai. I'm with UNDP. I wanted to ask all of you a question, but at the end I decided to go with the last person and to try and ask through our colleague from MSF. What I want to think about more is perhaps we're looking at the pyramid in the wrong way, because the last gentleman is talking about how many different actors are trying to engage with the UN and finding it to be difficult. I think very often the UN is talking about how we can organize everyone else rather than having perhaps our UN country team and the RC function or the SRSG function more like the conductor of an orchestra that we all wish she or he did. Because I want to ask you through MSF, how are we to engage with from the outside? How is the UN? Is the UN a coherent actor, or do you find us to repeat action? Do you find us to do things in parallel? And you don't need to honeycoat it, because I have traveled enough to be disappointed. So I'm just asking more from your point of view. Could that be something where we as a system could help this humanitarian principles and the humanitarian interface go better forward?
Thank you.
Here you are.
We collect a couple of questions.
Thank you. My name is Khalid Mansour. I'm an ex-aid worker. So for 13 years in aid and human rights organizations and development and peacekeeping, etc. And lucky me, now I have a hopefully long break to write and study about these issues. So me aside, I think Anthony touched a nerve when he spoke about the self-referential nature of our organizations, if I can still stay ours, that we are more interested in the growth of our in values of growth and values of turf. And I would add to that we are much more, or increasingly over the last 10 to 15 years, more accountable to donors and less accountable to beneficiaries. And since I did work on communication most of this time, that posed a big problem for me. Because the chasm between our rhetoric on the ground and the reality of the main drivers of our work in the ground has been growing and growing, which reflected itself in the increasing level of our safety and increasing level of access. And I'm not talking theory here. Just yesterday, the polio vaccinators in Nigeria were killed, before that in Pakistan. So I'm concerned that regardless of whether you are going to throw the baby or the water out of the bathtub, that your tub is cracked, and that other actors and beneficiaries might be actually at bringing it apart. And by that I mean the other actors that you spoke about as, should we include them in our club or not? I'm not sure all of them want to join your club, to start with. I mean, I find it a little bit amazing, for example, that we can discuss the future of the humanitarian aid system without having organizations from the Global South. Because in a few years, Islamic Relief International and Turkey will be really big actors in what we are doing. And they don't see eye to eye with you. And that can affect maybe all the way to the humanitarian principles. And maybe that can be seen in a positive light, because instead of one side trying to instrumentalize you, there will be different pressures to instrumentalize you in different directions, and then maybe they can balance or cancel each other out in certain aspects. Thank you.
Thank you. I will take maybe another question, and then we go back to the panel. Or maybe we just go back to the panel. And maybe also want to give the opportunity to our presenters, maybe if you want to respond to some of the points that the discussant made. Sophie, should we start with you?
Sure. I'm gonna be honest with you. I really don't envy these coordination mandates that the UN have, because I think it's really, really tough one. And we need to distinguish between emergencies and non-emergency setting. I think there is a huge difference, and we in MSF do value the role of the UN and their ability to. They are better equipped than any other organization on the ground to ensure the coordination in non-acute emergencies, and we fully respect that. What we have found, however, was that, and we've had multiple opportunities to express it, was that in emergencies, the cluster system does not give enough agility to the aid system to respond to the needs, and it becomes an end instead of a means for. So I mean, MSF doesn't. We don't have the solution. The solution that we found ourselves was to try to sometimes take some distance, staying as observers. So we are in every clusters, but we are observers, and we're not necessarily. And we want to keep the capacity if we believe that there are needs in this region, even though this region was not allocated to MSF, to go and have a look, make an assessment, and decide to respond to these needs if we believe we can make an added value. So I think that the concern we have is in acute emergencies, how actually can we maximize and optimize the presence and the role of the coordination role of the UN. You know, what we've realized in recent years, actually, Haiti is a very, very different example. It was a natural disaster. There were thousands of NGOs on the ground of different capacity, because you had NGOs whose mission, it was the first mission, and NGOs who had 40, 50 years experience. So it's very hard to coordinate in these circumstances. But what we've realized over these past, let's say, 2-3 years, is that there are less and less actors in major emergencies. So it's not an issue of coordination, honestly. It's really a matter of being there on time to do life-saving work. And there are, and this is maybe where the UN could play a tremendous role because they know better than anyone else who are the agencies who are able to provide this sort of assistance. And we would definitely welcome more aid in some circumstances. The latest we found was in South Sudan with the influx of refugees, and it's been really painful to operate there with such a lack of aid on the ground.
Thank you. So do you want to say anything on this?
Not on the second question. Yeah. No, thank you very much for the second question. I mean, as I try to highlight in my remarks, I also believe that the goal cannot be and must not be that we try to make everyone stakeholder of the system that we have right now. Of course, we need to strengthen the system, and we need to have that dialogue. And we see actually very promising effects that countries like China and others do both. I mean, they support the multilateral system as much as they want us to take into account the enormous expertise that they have acquired over 50 years in actually fighting natural disasters and others. So we also need to find ways of bringing that type of expertise into the system. But I think the point is, and that's what I wanted to and your comments brought this out, is it is not a system, and in a way you reconfirmed this, it's not a system that can be easily directed or where you have a lot of actors who will follow their own instincts and for deploying, for creating the NGO. And I think what you said is, I completely agree, is let's look, and in fact that's what we're doing. We look at the 20 big ones or 15 big ones in an emergency that sort of we coordinate with, and usually it's the ones with a lot of that receive a lot of funding. But I think the point is that, and Jeremy mentioned the point of universality. I don't think that this humanitarian system will ever be a system that is universal in the sense that we might hope for, that everyone subscribes to the core principles, that everyone prescribes to Resolution 46/182, General Assembly resolution, that is sort of the overall framework, at least normative framework for many of the multilateral aid agencies. But what they do want is entry points. We did have a few weeks ago in Cairo a meeting with Islamic charities. It was very interesting. None of them said, listen guys, we don't want to have anything to do with you. But they also made clear where the limits are. But what they did say is, we want to learn from you how you do how you are accountable, how you do financial accounting, how you maximize the efficiency and efficacy of your delivery to beneficiaries, how you do needs assessments. They wanted to talk about the impacts of counterterrorism legislation on their funding, and so on and so forth. There are opportunities to create relationships with them, and relationships are not built within a night. They're built over years, and the trust, basically, to sometimes invest in some of these organizations to say, okay, here we have this dialogue, you tell us what you do, where you do it, but we also give you the trust to actually do it. And then afterwards, we have a discussion and a critique, just as we have done this with many other NGOs. And I don't think that we are there yet. The second and my last point on this one is the changed viewpoints. I understand that you say we need to distinguish between emergencies, and I think you mean the conflict-specific ones rather than natural disasters. But sometimes it's not that easy. You know, you have situations like in Mali where you have all three of these caseloads in one. You have conflict, you have the need to reduce vulnerability, and you have natural disaster settings. So who does what? We have in Syria right now a situation where a number of NGOs says we can only do cross-line, combat line operations if we enter the country via Damascus, which means a certain proximity, at least in terms of logistics and everything else, with the government. Whereas others say we won't do this, we go cross border, you know. But what is also very clear is that very few, if any, NGO can afford to do both. So you need to come to a separation of within a conflict, in a situation of what adds value, what one organization can do over the other. And I think that's a system for which you constantly need at all levels a dialogue, awareness raising, explaining to do with member states, with new actors, with new donors and partners. And I think that's what makes it so difficult. But to assume that we'll be able to squeeze this into one coherent system, for me, is an illusion. And I think that's how we need to, and equally the illusion that whether it's OCHA or UNDP, the RC or anyone, that we are at the center of this. We provide one center, but the challenge very clearly is to bring other centers or sub-centers into that conversation. For that, I think we are very well set up, because even if the RC is not the only person, you have the World Bank, you have others and so on, you have very strong governments, so you do have different centers, but very often they are increasingly willing to work actually with the RCH, the resident coordinator, humanitarian coordinator system. So our ambition needs to be adjusted that way. Thank you.
Thank you. Antonio, I was wondering if you want to address the question if the bathtub is broken.
Yeah, I think it is cracked. Thank you, Khaled, for that metaphor. And I think it makes sense that people don't want to join our club. After all, we set the rules, and so why would they want to join? And I think we are also seeing something rather interesting, which is that, look at Turkey, for example. Now there's a critique of Turkey. Oh, but these NGOs, they're really the Turkish government. They're not independent. Hello, hello. We've been doing that for 30, 40, 50, 60 years and using our soft power to achieve objectives that, you know, Turkey is establishing itself. So I think it's going to be interesting when China, India, Mexico, Brazil, etc., etc. And that leads me to my second point, which is it's about, there's no monopoly of humanitarianism or humanitarian action. And of course, there's lots of traditions, there's no agreed definition, and it's a loose and ambiguous term. But what seems to be happening, which is of concern, is that the institutionalization of the system, you know, we're developing a network power here. You can join us on our terms. You have to accept our standards. So we're erecting barriers to entry for people who are different from us. And I think we have to be careful, because they may well decide that, you know, maybe they'll go a different route. Already in some countries, in Afghanistan, for instance, there is a resistance to the UN coordination mechanisms, because either they're not working or they're seen to be politicized. But also, sometimes they don't fit with what a particular NGO's objectives are. So I think, you know, we have to be more... I agree, I should have said it, that you know, although I'm probably considered as a dogmatic supporter of fundamentalist principles, I also agree that there are ways, that there are essential activities that have to take place, but that I wouldn't call humanitarian, and that have to be separate from the sort of ring-fenced humanitarian principle, humanitarianism.
Jeremy?
Yes, thank you. I would like also to react to Khaled's remark, notably to a part of your remark where you mentioned that it's somehow surprising that talking about the future of humanitarian action, that we do not have some other voices representing some other perceptions from those so-called emerging actors, either from the Middle East or from Africa or whatsoever. The thing, coming back to the principles, really, which is one of the focus of our discussion today, it's interesting to see how this discussion on the principles is quite European-centered or Western-centered discussion. And this is reflected here, because there is this interesting study or project from the Overseas Development Institute that does a research project on the history of humanitarianisms, maybe with a S, looking at different regions of the world. And anyway, they came up in one of their reports with one notion of this notion of the humanitarian principles being a very successful master narrative, the master narrative of the International Committee of the Red Cross, that was developed around, as I said earlier in my presentation, for specific context, specific reasons, to ensure access and safety to operate in those very specific contexts. I am not sure that those principles resonate very much to people coming from an African background or a Middle East background or an Asian background, because they were not part of this discussion maybe for the last 150 years, even though, there are national societies of Red Cross and Red Crescent that are part of this movement and subscribe to those same principles. But I guess what I want to say here is that, and to respond also to some of the points brought up by Hans-Jörg, is that for some reasons it seems that there was an absolute consecration of those principles in Resolution 46182 that showed the success of the Red Cross movement formula, of those principles of independence, impartiality, neutrality, and so on, whereas it is not necessarily adapted to all situations, to all objectives of the different actors that operate in this international relief world. And that's where it is probably important to demystify some of these principles that are too many times called upon saying, oh, we need to respect humanitarian principles, but with no reality in practice. To demystify them, to acknowledge that it is to respond to specific needs in specific situations, and acknowledge that, no, we are not all driven by those principles. And maybe this will facilitate also establishing a better dialogue with those other actors that can just play and that have to play a great role in international relief. Then call it humanitarianism or not, or international relief, or ICRC president recently labeled it as integrated relief operations, whatsoever. But I think there is a need of dialogue around really those principles. Thank you.
Please, let's take another round.
Probably should have raised my hand earlier. We're running out of time here. Paul Mikov, visiting scholar at Columbia. Just a couple of points, I suppose, that are also questions. We heard a little bit about the resource and the money question here in the discussion, but not, I suppose, as much as I expected, because in the final analysis, we all know, I think, and realize that whatever compromise might be happening vis-a-vis the humanitarian principles, it's not really a matter so much of watering down of the commitment by the vast majority of players to those humanitarian principles, but various other factors. New principles and commitments are emerging, as Hans-Jörg was saying. There is a development of self-understanding and the understanding of the mandates of the various agencies, therefore venturing more into human rights, political and advocacy kind of engagements, etc. But ultimately, it's a question, to a large extent, of resources and money for many organizations. In other words, the willingness to decide to undergo greater degree of instrumentalization and use by various political actors is ultimately a question of money, resources, branding, visibility, positioning. Can you speak, Antonio, you're shaking your hand a little bit, to that interface between the principles and resources, the question of resources? And I suppose somewhat related is the second point about the supremacy, growing supremacy of the consideration for safety and security. So much so that in many contexts, and I think you mentioned the bunkerization of humanitarian organizations, Antonio, the corporate security guys in these large organizations make the decisions even on programming, whether there should be programming and intervention or not. Can you a little bit speak about this compartmentalization of principles, the humanitarian kind of intent and imperative vis-a-vis those new developments? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other hands? No, good. So we go back to the panel, and maybe also add, if you have any final, Stephen. Antonio, let's start with Antonio.
I was shaking my head because if you take the ICRC, they get 90% of their money from Western donors, but they launder it, and it comes out without any strings attached. So if the ICRC can launder the money it gets from bilateral donors, maybe others can do it too. Of course, in certain situations, you're right that some major U.S. NGOs get 70–80% of their funds from the government, and therefore, you know, it has an impact on the way in which they set up projects and contracts, and the expectation that activities will continue. It creates a web of conditionalities between the agency and the government. At the other extreme, you have World Vision that gets very little money from the U.S. government. Whether they are part of U.S. soft power, I don't know, but certainly they're their values correspond very much to the values of you know, the religious communities in this country. I don't want to go any further into that because I might trip myself up. But then you have MSF, and MSF has strict rules about where it accepts money and where it doesn't. And MSF has also another, for me, interesting, and I'm not here to defend MSF. Sophie can do it much better than me. But MSF it also has a relationship with its donors that is slightly different, because you contribute money to MSF and then you can also become engaged in some way, making it maybe slightly less self-referential than some of the other NGOs that, you know, set their own agenda and do stuff depending on the money they have, etc. But I wanted to raise something that hasn't been raised, and it's been troubling me since this meeting started, and it's the fact that the world out there is complicated, and it's even more complicated because if you look at the ongoing crisis that the international community is dealing with, something like 70% of the spend for humanitarian action is going to crises that have been around for 10 years or more, you know, Afghanistan, Darfur, DRC. So maybe this is not a humanitarian issue per se, but it does say a lot about the inability of the system that the international community has created to deal with crisis to deal with root causes. Maybe that's, you know, but why is it that we are so bad at addressing the situations where hundreds of millions of people are left in limbo? You know, they are being fed and provide a little bit of assistance, but basically the international community is not really engaged in a way that solves the problem. I'm not saying the humanitarian should do it, but someone should do it. And as a humanitarian, or rather as a citizen, I'm concerned that we're not doing it.
Thank you, Francesco. Yes, I'd like to give my views briefly on the principle and funding question. Not that I have an answer, but Antonio mentioned the specificity of the ICRC, I mean, being funded 90% by government, still managing to have not much strings attached, even in its relationship with the Bush administration back, a few years ago, with all the tensions that there was on a number of different themes. One of them being obviously Guantanamo Bay. Even then. As far as I know, there was not much strings attached by the U.S. government on the ICRC. The U.S. government being still like funding 20%, I think, of the budget of the ICRC, which is huge. But I think this, and then the other actor, the other principled actor that we keep mentioning when we discuss about these issues is MSF. And where I will disagree maybe with Antonio is that I'm not sure that many other actors are able to join them in this principled undertaking, because if you look at these two actors, both have specificities explaining, from my point of view, their particular position. The ICRC, it's linked to the Geneva Conventions and to the fact that it is the guardian of IHL, that its role is recognized in the Geneva Conventions by the states parties to the Geneva Conventions, that gives it this very particular aura or position. And MSF, it is linked to this attachment to have funding coming mostly from individual donors, and MSF is a brilliant organization in doing so. So I am not sure that a lot of other organizations can join them, which is unfortunate. Or if they choose to join, then it requires to do some sacrifices, probably, and then indeed to accept maybe to have less funding from governments in order to lead a principled humanitarian action or independent and neutral humanitarian action. And then my last point would be on as a way of kind of conclusion from my side, is that my feeling, and it's something that I'm describing in this paper, is that the whole the mainstream humanitarian system, if I can say, led by the United Nations, with all the institutional apparatus that was put in place in the last 20 years, is increasingly going toward, it's kind of changing of ambitions, as I described in my remarks, and I will borrow a phrase used by a scholar and aid practitioner called Hugo Slim, who described it some years back, this system as going towards some kind of global welfare system, and I think it is quite an interesting view, and if it is so, we're going toward a global welfare system with growing ambitions and growing coverage. Then, once again, I think we need hard to rethink the foundations of this system, and probably that humanitarian principles are not fit for the ambitions of this system. But it would be important that the principled ones still stay there and is one of those actors that can contribute to the broader undertaking. Thank you.
Thank you. Sophie, please.
You know, the financial independence that we talk about when we talk about MSF is not something that happened overnight. It's a policy that has been put in place 40 years ago and that have led to lots of painful choices and sacrifices. So I would disagree with you, Jeremy, when you say that not a lot of organizations are able to do so. Any organization is able to take a certain path if they decide that this is the right one for the organization. When was in 2006, during the major Asian tsunami, we received 110 million euro in 2 days. This was unprecedented in the organization. And at the same time, our teams were conducting assessment in some countries where we're already based, which were impacted by the tsunami, to realize very quickly that our added value in responding to this emergency was very limited. And so for 3 days, there's been an intense debate in the organization, and a very, very violent one, actually, between those who believed we should not accept this money and those who believed that we should send it back. In the end, it's the principles that led us to call each of the donors and ask them to redirect the fund or to send the money back. And what is the reason why I'm giving this example, it's very anecdotal, but it happened to be the best marketing operations MSF has ever done in its history. And so this is to say that what may look like, a tension between resources and principle, when dealing with this tension, you have to be very careful of the low-hanging fruits and not to be too short-sighted, because in the long run, it might really pay off because you build such a great amount of credibility. So it might not be, and it doesn't mean that it's one example, and we've made certainly plenty of other mistakes beside this example, but this is to say that it's a policy that you build over time and you always have a choice to put the threshold at a certain level. This being said, I think that surprisingly what is more difficult for us and challenging at this moment is not the tension between financial resources and principles. It's the tension between human resources and principles. Because in most of the places where we work at the moment, we are actually forced, for reasons of security, to exclude some nationalities, because we don't want to expose them, we don't want to expose the patients, etc. These, in my view, are severe breaches against our principles of sort of universal action and in being an international organization and not ourselves falling into the trap of targeting some specific nationalities. So I'm much more worried about this aspect, where, including in MSF, we've actually selected some type of staff to work in some areas. We're not sending a French to Mali at this time, and you would understand why. We've not sent Americans to Afghanistan for many, many years, although we need some very qualified of our US doctors and surgeons there. So this is a very dangerous path that we need to look at, including in MSF.
Thank you. Hans, you're the final word.
Thank you. I guess your question was partly rhetorical in terms of asking whether there was a nexus between funding and organization activity. Of course there is, and you know, not everyone, I would still argue, can make the same choices in reality that MSF has made. But this is besides the point. I think there are some interesting things happening also on the funding side. I mean, one is really how organizations, and rightly so, inoculate themselves through the funding that they receive or through strict adherence to principles and a specific understanding of the principles. And those of you who've worked with me for a while know that I've never been one who preached that everyone needs to be the same. Not everyone needs to be operating like a UN agency. I actually think it is irresponsible to have everyone be the same. Sometimes we need to cultivate a system of diversity, not only culturally, but also in terms of our added value, where we have situations, we have organizations that can actually go and do things in situations that other organizations cannot do. And so they need to make sure, and luckily we have organizations like MSF and ICRC that do make some of those choices, and it's important that we also protect their rights and their way of doing that. But others may not. Someone mentioned, Khaled mentioned the Turkish NGOs. It's actually very interesting. Not each of those Turkish NGOs just wants to be a subcontractor to the Turkish government, being the interest and being predetermined by the Turkish government what you do. A lot of them now say, actually, they say, well, we're sort of quasi-independent. We want to be a bit more independent from the government. But so we want to learn from you how actually have you organized themselves, let's say in Germany or in England or in other countries. How have NGOs over time organized themselves to coordinate with the government, to make more independent claims vis-a-vis the government? You know, and I think this dialogue that I mentioned is very important. One point that hasn't really come up today that for me is important around the principles. And now I would say we shouldn't be throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Of course, no one argues that those traditional humanitarian principles, the three in particular, plus independence, which has always been only been added in 2005 or 2006 by ECOSOC and the General Assembly, so in the United Nations framework, in fact. But which is humanity, which is need. At the end of the day, what we're trying to do, and I think that's why we're all in this business, we want to make sure that people in need get their needs accommodated in the fastest and best possible and most adequate and appropriate manner. I think that's the interest. And I've always also belonged to those who do not deny anyone, any actor, whether they are from the military, whether they're from the private sector, per se, the claim that they want to do, that they're serious about addressing those needs. I think higher moral ground doesn't necessarily help here. But we then need to look at what choices do need to be made so that some people in some situations can actually be the only ones who can reach people in need when no one else can, because they're too closely affiliated like the United Nations sometimes, with peacekeeping or other efforts that may be ongoing, or political efforts that may be ongoing in the situation at the same time. So you do need organizations that have a bit more of that arm's length or kilometers length away from the United Nations, but at the same time finding ways between these different actors to actually still connect with each other. I mean, I have not been to a single field situation where we didn't have, whether it's formal or informal, a very good dialogue with MSF, because it's very necessary that you know what you guys are doing, where you cover things, and so on, so that we direct others into a different direction. For me, at the center, and this also goes into this vulnerability discussion, the three caseloads. It's not only conflict. We mustn't look at this humanitarianism issue and the principles issue just through the lens of conflicts. We do have every single day, and it's a number since the food crisis that has stuck with me and I will never forget because I didn't know before. Every single day, 25,000 to 30,000 children die from malnutrition and related causes. The vast majority of those children is not dying in conflict areas, they are actually dying in those that we, until 10 years ago, 8 years ago, 7 years ago, actually labeled development caseloads. So no humanitarian was there. OCHA, 6 or 7 years ago, had 17 or 18 offices. We now have 38 offices, many in these countries, because many other actors, WFP, UNICEF and others, have also gone into these areas because need has dropped basically from a chronic to a very acute need. People are dying, you know. What could be more acute, more humanitarian to address the needs of dying people from thirst, from hunger, from anything else? Nothing. But until 10 years ago, or even less so, we had a system, humanitarian development, whatever it is. And I think that's where new challenges arise, where we need to address some of these things with developmental long-term actors, with governments, with different ministries. So the last point, just to make a reflection of all of this, is that the interest overall in humanitarian assistance, and it sometimes reminds me a bit of a discussion that wholesalers must have, what constitutes organic or green or so. There is no sort of silver plate standard for this. You know, we need to reach out to as many actors, new actors as we can, to convince them that either our principles and respect for our principles is correct, or we get them to adhere to as many of these standards and principles and ambitions as we can do. That's unfortunately the tedious way we need to move forward. What we will not have, I think, it's unrealistic, is a ring-fence system of a humanitarian multilateral system that has one set of rules when almost the same amount of money, sometimes more, goes through very different channels, but on the ground, in the field, the people who receive that aid very often don't care whether it's developed by a military person, by a private sector person, by a UN person or someone else. So we are bound to find ways of engaging with these actors. We are bound to find ways of having discussions around principles and interoperability. That doesn't mean to sell out on our principles, and that also means that we sometimes have to take the flag, perhaps as a UN coordination system, when others shouldn't or cannot do. But what would be wrong is to say, we're here, you're there, we don't want to have anything to do with you. And for me, we cannot even afford this. This would be rendering us into irrelevance over the next 25 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Antje. Very good. I think we reached the conclusion of this panel. Please join me to thank our speakers and discussant. And for those who are interested to continue thinking about these topics, again, I recommend both the book and the paper, which are available outside. And I hope to see you soon back here at IPI at our Humanitarian Affairs series. Thank you very much.
Thank you.